Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Arkiva webinar on using what-if scenarios to create a dynamic IBP paradigm, a topic near and dear to my heart. I'm joined today with Dr. Vicky Fulmore, who is a senior optimization consultant here at Arkiva and has supported a lot of projects where what-if scenarios are used to make decisions. My name is Sujit Singh, and I will be moderating the webinar today. So before we jump into the subject matter for today, a little bit about Arkiva. As some of you may know, we have been in business since 1993, and for the last 28 years or so, we have been focusing exclusively on supply chain planning. We create software as well as services to help our customers do supply chain planning better. And we have been recognized by Gartner in the latest version of their Magic Quadrant. For example, we are in the Visionary Quadrant. We are very proud about that. We have customers all across the globe, as you can see from the map. And at this time, we are approaching 20,000 users. And if we look at the amount of revenue of our customers that is planned through our software, we are approaching the 75 billion mark. Our software is industry agnostic. We work with a lot of different industries, CPG, chemicals, petrochemicals, discrete industries, and really all the different modules of the software can be applied to a lot of these different industries and create value. We are a global company. We have offices in North America, in Wilmington and Philadelphia, as well as in Antwerp, Belgium, and in Mangalore, India. As far as our solution offering is concerned, we support our customers across the entire range of integrated business planning or sales and operations planning. We typically begin our projects with demand planning. This is the place where you do statistical forecasting, collaborative forecasting. We extend that into inventory management, whether it's a single echelon or a multi-echelon. We provide tools to manage the balancing of supply and the demand, and associated with that, doing capacity planning. And then, of course, supporting the S&OP process itself, which typically requires monitoring, visualization, and execution support. And underlying all these areas is an integrated financial plan where if you want to, you can not only plan in volumes and units, but integrate the dollar impact of that into your S&OP and IBP plan. All right, so with that introduction of Arkiva done, let's turn this over to Vicky, who will now tell us, what she intends to talk about and lead us through the presentation. So, Vicky, all yours.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. Looking forward today to showing you a little bit how Arkiva works with what-if analysis and how it's very useful in S&OP, but also in integrated business planning as a whole. So we'll start today by talking about the differences between S&OP and IBP, and then we'll dive into some different types of what-if analysis and how we would handle them, and then we'll have a look inside Arkiva to see how we can use that tool to help us with the process. Anytime any change happens, there's always that aspect of the change management. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about implementing change. In the cases that we're going to talk about, sometimes that change is thrust upon us, and sometimes it's change that we take on voluntarily. So I want to think about how do you manage that in your organization. And then finally, we'll talk about just some conclusions and takeaways, looking forward to some interaction with the audience. So we'll have some polls and some opportunities for you to give some feedback. So I welcome your involvement, and we'll also welcome any questions or comments on the way.
Hey, Vicky, since you mentioned feedback, let's clarify. The questions portion of the GoToWebinar is open for you to type in your comments, certainly questions, but as well as comments. If you have any feedback for us, please use that channel. And then, of course, you mentioned the polls, which we will bring up as at the appropriate time.
Great. Okay, let's get started. So Sujit showed you earlier this diagram of Arqiva's S&OP process and how all of our tools can work together to really manage your supply chain. What I want to talk about now is sort of the next generation, if you will, of S&OP, which we're starting, the term integrated business planning is starting to take over the concept. So how are they different? Well, S&OP is very important. Its focus is really on midterm, let's say, 12 to 18 months range. And so how does that fit into the overall picture? Well, we can really think of S&OP as kind of one component of integrated business planning. All right, so all the things Sujit talked about are certainly very important, but the idea of IBP is to integrate that with more longer term goals, more wider reaching, more corporate wide goals. So you're talking about your strategic and commercial planning, sales forecasting and budgeting in the long term, right? So the key of IBP is having consistent KPIs, collaboration and communication across the corporation within your S&OP departments, but also throughout all levels, all aspects of your corporation. So the idea is that we have common goals, and everything is working towards those common goals, and you don't have these competing motivations. That's the biggest key, because a lot of times we see in corporations, one part of the organization is incentivized to move in one direction, while another one is incentivized to go in the exact opposite direction, and that's where stalemates happen. So just so that's what we're going to talk about now, is integrated business planning and how the what ifs are so important in that paradigm. All right, so moving on to what ifs. So we're going to talk about some examples of what ifs, so it's different types, if you will, of how we think about what if analysis, and then the strategies of how you approach them. The first one we're going to talk about is what we call imminent disruptions. So these are near term, hard to predict things that come up that we have to deal with. So examples might be a labor strike, a machine breakdown. Those are bad imminent disruptions, but on the positive side, you might have a big government contract that's about to go to one of your customers, but you don't know which one, okay? If you have multiple customers in the same sector, and one of those gets the demand, that's going to be an impact, depending on whether that customer is on, say, the East Coast or the West Coast. That's going to impact your supply chain, but you don't know quite how. Another example is challenges to the status quo. So this is more medium to long-term proposed changes. So this is more of a proactive type of what-if situation. And because we're getting into more the long-term range, again, this is where the IBP focus comes into play. So if you currently have single sourcing at your plants, maybe for just ease of production planning, maybe there's some physical restrictions, you might want to see what would happen if you relax those requirements and had more multi-sourcing of your plants. That would open up options for you to maybe improve your distribution network by having more sources scattered throughout your network. So that this is a way that you could see the cost and the benefits of changing that business practice. You might also be facing a situation where you think you need a new distribution center, or maybe you have a distribution center that you feel is being underutilized, and so you want to see what would happen if you either closed or opened, as the case may be. Okay. And then another thing I want to throw out there, and this could be a whole nother webinar on its own, but target inventories are something that we use to hedge against uncertainty in our supply chain. when you have an integrated supply chain model and you've got all that interaction between demand and supply and distribution and transfers and pre-builds and all those things, it could be interesting to take away your target inventories and see where an optimization model, an integrated supply chain planning model, would put your inventory levels. Because presumably that model is going to make sure that all your demand is met as timely as possible. It pre-builds where it needs to. It moves things to warehouses as it needs to. And it might just be an interesting exercise to see where the system would put your inventories, and you can compare that to your targets, and you might use that information to adjust your target inventory levels, and you could analyze the financial impact of those kinds of things. The third type of what if we're going to talk about is what we call black swan events. So these are immediate, high impact, and unexpected events. So the imminent direct disruption is also unexpected, but this is more, this is bigger and darker, right? So we have short-term and long-term examples here. Short-term would be a hurricane. Most recently, we had the issue with the Suez Canal blockage. Sure, there'll be many supply chain white papers written on that, because that certainly left a lot of people scrambling. Long-term, if you have a fire at the plant goes down, it's going to be a long time before that plant's back up. So now some shifting needs to happen. And then, of course, near and dear to all our hearts, our supply chain impact of COVID. So these are our what we'll call black swan events. All right, so now want to bring you guys a little bit into the conversation, if you will. So we're going to open up one of the polls, and I would just want to get a sense from the audience what type of events you have experienced personally in your jobs with, you know, from a supply chain management standpoint. So we had the three types: imminent disruptions, challenges to the status quo, black swan events.
So as we can see, people have voted on the black swan event as the highest category, 95%.
I'm guessing that's COVID for most people, but who knows? Right. So it looks like everybody is, or most people have experienced one or more of these events. So I guess that's why you're here today. So let me ask you another question. What is your experience with what if analysis?
And as you can see, the back of the envelope reply has garnered the most votes.
Interesting. I like to see we have a few daredevils out there that like to live life on the edge. So that's, I like that. Okay. All right. So back in the envelope. Yeah, that's, I'm not surprised that that is the most common approach, because I think a lot of people, you know, are so familiar with their production system and their supply chain that they would feel that they have a good sense of what needs to happen when something changes. What I'm going to show you today is that works pretty well. I think, you know, because you're familiar with your process, you know how things are going to respond. But what I'm going to show you is that there are ripple effects that you might not realize are there. There are impacts that are not necessarily intuitive. And if when you use a tool like the one I'm going to show you, you can get even more out of these kinds of analyses. And not only that, but it's going to make it easier for you to take the more proactive approach to anticipating changes. So having said that, oops, all right. So how do you do a what if analysis? Well, in a tool like Arkiva, or Excel or whatever system you're using, the first thing you're going to do is adjust the input according to the scenario that you want to analyze. So if it's your resources, you'll might shut down your plant by turning capacity down to 0, shutting off a work center. Maybe your labor force is cut because of some issues there, but you still have the same work centers and you want to redistribute labor. You might change your demand profile, whether it's inputting it for a new customer or decreasing it because you lost some demand. Distribution network input, adding new warehouses, taking warehouses away, and watching the input. One thing to keep in mind, it really only makes sense to include things that you might actually do, right? So throwing a lot of options at the model that are things that aren't even really feasible, then it's just a kind of a waste of processing time and waste of you setting those up. So I would really caution you to include only things that really make sense. When you are doing something like adding a warehouse, one thing to keep in mind is you can't really ask the model, where should I put this warehouse, right? You have to give it choices. So maybe you have 2 or 3 potential sites. So you would enter those 3 either all together or one at a time, depending on what makes sense. And then you would just see if the model would use it or not. So that's kind of, how that works. And once you've done that, you let the model rebalance your supply chain, and then you compare your base case with these various scenarios, and you look at the impact from a business standpoint, from a product flow standpoint, and you look at the changes in costs, right? And then you ask the question, are the changes worth the savings, right? One thing to keep in mind when you're doing these comparisons is there are intangible impacts as well. So maybe you're saving a lot of money, but are you really going to be able to, say, relocate your workforce to some new location? Or will half of them quit and now you'll have to rehire, and that complicates things. Or so you have to consider the intangibles also. But by having these comparisons, you at least know what the saving, either the savings or the increase in costs, is going to be as you evaluate your options.
So Vicky, maybe a quick question on adjusting the input, maybe taking a simple example. If we are talking about adding a work center or taking away, in essence, go to the capacity table. If you're adding it, increase the hours.
Yeah.
If you're taking it away, make the hours 0.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. All right. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So let's go ahead. What I want to do now is go into Arqiva and show you some examples. And again, just to make you guys feel like you are part of the experience, I'm going to ask you, which of these examples do you want to see today? So let's then go into Arqiva and have a look at our base case, and then we'll go from there. All right, so want to start just with a visual of our base case, and this is easiest to look at it through a graph, and then we can, I'm going to just show you a little bit of the data that's driving it. We've got, and this is sort of a sample database, pretty straightforward, pretty simplistic, just to make the point. So we have these 4 plants: Iowa, Virginia, Texas, and Colorado. We have 1 warehouse in Georgia, and all of the blue nodes are customers. Okay, so currently you can see right now there's a lot of activity going on here in the middle. The Davenport plant is very popular. We're also making great use of this warehouse in Georgia. Now, one thing that you have to keep in mind when you are looking at an integrated supply chain system, as I said, there are ripple effects, okay? And there are also sort of competing dynamics. So you might have one plant that has a lot of capacity, or it's inexpensive, but it's really far away. That kind of thing. So you might have a warehouse that it's cheaper to hold inventory there, but there are limits on how much you can put there, and you don't want to overfill it because you don't want inventory there for indefinite amount of times. So there's always these competing costs and drivers, and that's why having an integrated system is so powerful, because it really balances all of that movement. So just want to give you a real quick view of the data for this particular situation, just to give you a sense of what to expect when we do these changes. So for example, Right now, the plant in Iowa, Davenport, just happens to have the cheapest. So the production costs vary by what material we're making, but I added this multiplier just because I didn't want them to all be the same. So we have the most capacity in Iowa, and it's also the cheapest to make, okay? The next cheapest is Cortez, but it has the least amount of capacity. And then you can see Richmond and Houston get gradually more expensive, and we have a little bit more capacity there. So again, you're going to see the cost and the capacity sort of balance off each other. And just to sort of give you a sense of where we are to start, because I am going to ask you what you think is going to happen when this spot order comes into play. So I want to just show you here what the production looks like in the baseline scenario. So the Davenport plant, which we said had up to 300,000 in capacity, hopefully you can see these numbers, but I'll kind of give you the gist of it. We're not running it full out, okay? If you look over the weeks, we get close a couple times. We get hit 291,000, 295,000 out in August, but we are not running it full out, even though it's got a lot of capacity and it's the cheapest. All right, so the reason for that, it could be a lot of things. It might be that the customers in the southern states are just too far away. So even though it's cheapest to make it there, it's offset by the increase in transportation costs. So overall, it's not worth it. And that's why it's so important to not look at one cost in a vacuum, right? Because they all contribute to the bottom line. We can also see that Cortez, on the other hand, is after the first couple of weeks running full out. In general, we're going to see this pattern of building up as we go, and that's because in this situation we have a lot of starting inventory, so it's going to burn through the inventory to the extent that it can, and then you can see it kind of reach a steady state. Okay, so we have Cortez running full out, Davenport and none of the other plants running full out. Okay, so that, you know, might be what you expect, might not be what you expect, but that's the situation. So that's the baseline. And all right, so if we want to look at the spot order, let's go ahead now back to our map and take a sort of mental picture of where we are. And then I'm going to go ahead and change what we're showing to the big spot order. So it's kind of hard to see here what changed, but a little bit changed. So what we're going to do to make it a little easier is I'm going to just highlight where things changed. So this is where flow increased. So here's the new customers up here in New Jersey. All right. So when I said that you don't necessarily, it's not always intuitive, the impact. If I were just doing this back of the envelope, I probably would have just given some extra production in Richmond where I had some spare capacity, and I would have left it at that, right? But what this is showing us is that really, if you really want to get the best out of this opportunity, we're really going to shift some things. We're going to move some things to the warehouse. We're going to, in Houston is now going to be using this warehouse where it wasn't before. And we're actually going to supply this new customer through a combination of production from Davenport, Houston, and Virginia. All right. So even though the obvious thing would be just to use the closest plant, this tool is telling us, no, you can actually do better by shifting all of this. And on top of that, we can see where the flow decreases. Because in order to make those increases, something had to give. So, and again, this isn't something we would necessarily anticipate. So it looks like we have some product that was going to the warehouse here is no longer going there because it is reassessing some of the production to satisfy that new demand. So the point of this is that the changes that are made to get the most out of these opportunities aren't always what you would anticipate just doing back of the envelope, okay? Now, another thing I want to show you is what happens as a result of this. And before I show you, I'm going to ask you to add into the questions window. I want to get some input from you guys, and I want you to tell me, what do you think, and I should have asked you this before, but I forgot, but I am going to ask you this. What do you think is going to happen to the overall bottom line? Do you think total costs are going to go up or total costs going to go down? What do you think is going to happen?
So we want responses through the questions section in the GoToMeeting window. Hopefully you all can access that. And
I just want to get a sense of what you think the impact's going to be.
Right. So just while they are doing that, the graph, the map that you showed us was interesting. It seemed to have moved the shipping into the Georgia warehouse up from the Davenport plant, but reduced it out of the Norfolk plant.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
and that's the thing about it does this rebalancing that is really hard to come up with on your own because there's so many moving parts.
okay, so we're beginning to get some responses to the questions. Frank says the total cost will go down. Mark says we should expect the production cost to go down. And then there's another response from Darren, who is also kind of saying costs will go down.
Okay.
And then Misty says, if done correctly, total cost should be minimal given the range of costs to produce. I imagine she's saying total cost change should be minimal. Okay, and then there are more questions about, we need more clarity about what the parameters were and so on. So okay. Yeah, let's, right. A lot of pointers towards costs going down.
So, and that's one of the things when you're doing this what if analysis is you want to sort of have some sanity checks. All right. So you want to make sure that things are at least moving in the direction that you assume. So let's think about this for a minute. So this is a cost minimization problem, right? It's not, so we're not doing profit maximization, we're doing cost minimization. So if we have an increase to demand, we now have to make more, right? And if we have to make more, that's going to cost more. Now, will total production costs go up? Probably, but the model might find a way to rebalance things to take advantage of some of the lower cost plants and hopefully lead to minimal increases in production costs. Similarly, there'll be extra, again, it's going to be a sort of one step forward, two steps back kind of thing. We now have to ship more products, so that's going to drive transportation costs up. And presumably we probably don't have to have any more in inventory as long as we have the capacity. So so we got questions. Transportation costs is definitely considered. It's based on distance. Warehouse capacity, do not have warehouse capacity in this model, but you certainly could. But we do have production capacity. So we did see the changes in the flow. So let me just start with just an overview comparison. So let's look at, and this is just a very high level scenario name that's more interesting. So we have the big spot order. So I want to do just a side-by-side comparison. So the first 4 lines are costs, and then the bottom 5 lines are units. So baseline plan sums up to 730 million. Oh no, sorry, that's average. Sum $2.922 million. Okay. Total costs. the what if is going to result in 2.97. So 2.92 to 2.97. So the costs do go up. Presumably your profit will also go up because your revenues will also go up, right? So the overall profit should increase, but costs themselves will go up because you're making and shipping more, okay? Ideally, you would have some revenues in here, and then you could do a true profit maximization, but for purposes of this demonstration, we're just gonna have costs in there. Now we can also see sort of a comparison of what's going on. We see, yes, in fact, production activity does go up. Our interplant transfers have increased a little bit, not a lot. And shipments to customers go up because our demand went up, right? So all of those things are happening. But we do see that our ending inventory actually went down. So that's something maybe we didn't expect. And I suspect what happened there is that some starting inventory that was maybe too far away to use in the base case, the model decided was actually, let's use it now. It's beneficial to use it now in lieu of the extra production. So the point of all this is that it's not always intuitive what the impact is going to be. And that's why it's so powerful to have a tool like this, okay? To really get the most out of these changes, whether it's to minimize the financial impact of something bad happening that you have no control over, or to take full advantage of an opportunity, okay? All right, so I want to do one more example real quick. I don't think we're going to get to the third one, but I do want to show one more. Okay, so the second choice was a machine breakdown. Now, before I show it to you on the graph, I'm going to ask you this time, what do you think is going to happen? So we're going to go back to the base case. What do you think is going to happen if we have a machine breakdown? And the machine breakdown, I will tell you where it is. I think it was in, no, it wasn't in Virginia. The machine breakdown is in Texas. All right, so what do you think is going to happen when the machine breaks down? How do you think it's going to shift the production? What do you think is going to happen to the total cost? So go ahead and enter into the questions window, and just to see now, based on what we learned from the first example, what do you think is going to happen in the second one?
So machine has broken down, but the demand has not changed. And so what you're asking is, if we want to still try to meet that demand, will it be more difficult for us or less difficult for us? More difficult implying cost will go up, and less difficult will imply that cost will go down, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So let's see if we are beginning to get some response.
So Mark made a very good comment about a what-if analysis that covers costs without revenue. Is only half an analysis. I agree with you wholeheartedly that cost minimization is not the same as profit max. Some of your bigger margins might be on the more expensive products to make. And I would encourage you to include revenue and prices in your models as much as you can. Our experience is that clients sometimes have a hard time coming up with accurate data for this because there are promotions, there are quantity discounts, there are regional changes in prices. So coming up with a price isn't always easy, but 100% if you can have a revenue in your optimization model so that you're doing a true profit max, you're absolutely right. It's going to be that much better. So, yeah. Okay, so we think production costs will go up. We think production will shift, but costs will go up. Yep. All right. Darren's given us even specifics. It's going to go up in Iowa and Virginia. Perfect. Okay. Yeah. So things are going to shift. So here's the thing about shifting production. So if we go back to the base case, reset all filters. one way you can think about it is this answer is the optimal balance solution of this model, okay? So the capacity that it's using in Texas is the best, this is the optimal amount, okay? Texas is not full out. We saw that in the production report, that it's not full out capacity. So here's how we can think about it, and we can look at the answers to see if it matches. If the breakdown takes away production that I'm not using anyway, then I won't see any change, right? But if the model is but if the breakdown is cutting into production I wanted to use, then the answer can only get worse, because by definition, this is the least cost solution. So if you take away some of my options, then my cost can only go up. So that's the kind of thinking you have to do when you're looking at this. You want to make sure that your solutions make sense. And if you see something opposite of that, then you have to dig in to see if maybe there was a data issue, or maybe maybe there's something else going on that you didn't anticipate. All right. So again, not real easy to see when we do it this way, but if we look at just the changes. So we have increases of flow here. So this makes sense. I think somebody said Virginia and Iowa. Darren, you get the prize. Although we did even see some in Boulder. So again, this is a point I'm trying to make. All three plants have an impact, okay? And that kind of system-wide rebalancing is something you're never going to get with something that's not an integrated tool like this. So that's what I really want to drive home, is that if you're doing back of the envelope, you're probably missing some opportunity. And then we can also see, you can see then where things shift downward. So here, obviously this is going to happen because this is the production that it can't do. But we also saw a decrease up here in Iowa to make up for the production that it needed to pick up, okay? So again, ripple effects, and that's key, all right? So we're running short on time, but I think that the picture says 1,000 words, as they say, so we can do maybe just real quick. I'll do just to do a real quick comparison of the totals. So if we remember, this was 2.922, and if we look this up, it's 2.970. So yes, we did get an increase. We have a decrease, an overall decrease in production. So again, it's probably using some starting inventory. Some shifts in interplant transfers. We're still satisfying all the demand, which is key. And our ending inventory has gone down. So this is telling me that it's using some starting inventory that was located a little further away than it wouldn't have used if it could have produced. So again, it's balancing the costs. Okay, so hopefully those two examples were clear. And now I'm going to jump back to PowerPoint and kind of wrap some things up. So implementing change. This is something that is so important that I feel like I need to mention it whenever we talk about managing a business process. Sometimes you have these disruptions where you don't have a lot of time to prepare. Sometimes it's a proactive kind of thing, and you do. Change is hard for people. So you want to make sure that you have a culture that when things need to change, whether it's quickly or deliberately, that your people will be responsive to it. And in order to do that, you need to communicate and reassure, always from the beginning, early and often, right? You want to prepare, you want to anticipate pushback so that you can address it, and you need to support it. And it's very important to have that support from the top level, because when we're talking about integrated business planning, it's affecting everybody. You can't make a change in one place that's going to affect somebody else, because that other group is going to, you're not the boss of me. You can't tell me how to run my department. Just because you're making changes doesn't mean I have to make changes, right? So you don't want to get into that situation. So the support needs to come from the top. The message needs to be whatever one group does affects the other, and we all are working towards the same goal. And you want to, and it's just important that you need to manage that. That could be a whole nother webinar, but not today. All right, one last chance to hear from you guys. And that is just some quick takeaways from today's webinar.
So one of the questions that is coming in, Vicky, is can we have balanced scorecard model based on some weight assigned on each metrics?
Yes, the short answer is yes. I am a big fan of using real costs as much as possible. I think what happens is we get in the habit of weighting because we have a sense of what's important. But just to continually beat my drum here, when you have an optimization tool, it might give you an answer that it goes against what you thought was the most important or the most sensitive, okay? And so if you impose those weights and penalties, you might be driving the model away from its true optimum. So in the cases where you have real costs, I would encourage you to use them as much as possible. I realize it's not always an option. In some cases, you do have to use these penalties and weights, but understand whatever weights and penalties you assign will affect the answer. So you can change the answer by the weightings that you put on there, for better or worse.
If I may just add to that,
Yep.
For Sudhita, the question about balanced scorecard. Some of the balanced scorecard, the 4 axes that try to balance things on, some of them are tangible and others are not. So you will have to, if you want to use that, it is possible, just like Vicky said, but the other thing would be, how do you convert those intangibles into numbers so that you can do the cost comparison? All right, very good. Let's see. Glad to already have committed to an Arkiva SNLP implementation. Well, thank you, Mark. What if scenario capability of the tools and integrated picture of demand? That's what Ghanshyam has learned, so that's great. Great session. It's great. Some good remarks there. Does this tool have replenishment planning? Yes. In fact, that's how the network, if you saw, Vicky is calculating what is going from a plant to a warehouse. Vicky, would you disagree with that?
No, absolutely. And it also includes raw material procurement as well.
Yeah. And Ghanshyam, you asked, does this tool have forecasting capability? Yes, if you remember one of the very first graphics, we have demand planning. That's where we do forecasting, we have inventory. Today's session has been around the supply-demand balancing. That was the third peg in that circle. But yes, these forecasting capabilities do exist in this software.
Awesome. All right. All right, then I'm just gonna, feel free to continue to add comments and questions, and we will take them at the end. And in the meantime, I'm gonna just wrap up here with some conclusions from today's webinar. So we talked about three different types, but I'm gonna group them as disruptions and opportunities. All right, so disruptions happen when you don't necessarily expect it. A good planner will prepare for these possible scenarios, not necessarily waiting for them to happen, but using a what if tool to think about possible scenarios, run them to get a sense of what the impact is going to be. Okay, that way when something unanticipated happens, you're not going to be caught off guard. You're not going to panic. You can recalibrate quickly because you know you have the tools and you've used the tools and you have the practice of thinking how to respond calmly and intelligently. All right, sometimes these things come out of the blue and can really wreak havoc on your system. But if you know you have a tool that will simply rebalance, you're going to feel a lot better. The other thing that this will give you is if you do enough of these analyses, you're going to start to get the sense of where the weak links are in your supply chain. And that will give you the ability to maybe reinforce the weaker areas. So if you have one plant that you know is very sensitive to changes, you want to make sure that, you know, maybe you have a backup generator in case the power goes out, or you have a contractor that can pick up some of the production if you need to. And you might need that in one plant, but not in another. And so you start to get the sense of where the weaknesses are, and then you can plan contingencies so that not only do you have a tool to rebalance things, but you have the contingencies in place when these things happen. And then on the other side, you have opportunities. So taking it to even the next level, you can use this what if analysis to identify opportunities proactively. So you can play around with this and say, well, what if I put this warehouse in Wyoming, for example? And you can see that this reduces my overall costs without changing production or demand. And the cost savings is much greater than it would cost you to build that warehouse. Okay, now you can take that to your senior management and have that conversation, lowering the risk and the uncertainty of the outcome. So if you say, I think we should build a warehouse in Wyoming, and they're going to say, well, you know, we're not going to just go build a warehouse in Wyoming, and you say, yeah, but look, they're going to feel a lot better about actually thinking about it, right? So having a tool like this really takes away a lot of that risk and uncertainty of some of the things you're thinking about doing. So that is all I have for today.
Great. Well, Vicky, this was a great presentation. Thank you so much for doing this. I think we have a lot of resources along these lines on this topic on our website. We have white papers, infographics, and so on. So I encourage everybody to take a look. Of course, send us any questions that you might have. We have tried to address most of them here during the session, but you have our email addresses on the very first slide, as well as, you know, just the Arqiva general email address. So feel free to reach out to us. And if you want to see this tool in action, you know, feel free to reach out, and we can certainly set up a demo for you with your data, without your data, as the case might be. All right. So with that said, we have already done quite a few questions. So I think it's a good moment to bring this great webinar to a close. I appreciate the very active participation from everybody, all the good comments and questions, as well as participation in the poll. I want to thank Vicky once more for doing such a great presentation, and I hope to see you again in one of the future Arqiva webinars. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.